Welcome to a new video in which we will delve deeply into the great work, The Wealth of Nations, by Adam Smith. Alongside thinkers like David Ricardo, Karl Marx, John Maynard Keynes, and Friedrich Hayek, Adam Smith rightfully ranks among the most important economists in human history. To do justice to this epical work that initiated the field of economics as we know it, we will first explore Smith's biography in the initial part of the video, focusing explicitly on the life circumstances and historical context in which The Wealth of Nations was written. Adam Smith was born on the 5th of June in 1723 in Kirkcaldy, a small fishing village on the east coast of Scotland. He was the only child of Margaret Douglas and Adam Smith Sr., a customs officer who died shortly before his son's birth. Smith was raised under the care of his mother, who strongly influenced him and supported his education. At the age of 14, Smith began his studies at the University of Glasgow, where he studied under Francis Hutcheson, a prominent moral philosopher of the Scottish Enlightenment. Hutcheson's teachings deeply shaped Smith's moral and philosophical thinking. In 1740, Smith received a scholarship that allowed him to study at Balliol College, Oxford University. However, his time at Oxford was less satisfying, as he found the teaching methods there outdated and restricted. After returning to Scotland in 1746, Smith began a series of lectures in Edinburgh that were well received and established his reputation as a scholar. In 1751, he became a professor of logic at the University of Glasgow, and a year later, he switched to the professorship of moral philosophy. During his time in Glasgow, Smith published his first major work, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, in 1759. In this book, he laid out his views on human ethics and the role of sympathy as the basis of moral action. In 1764, Smith accepted an invitation from the young Duke of Buccleuch to accompany him on an educational tour through Europe. This grand tour took them to France, where Smith spent significant time in Toulouse, Geneva, and Paris. In France, he met some of the leading intellectuals of his time, later known as the Physiocratic School, or les economists, including François Quesnay and Anne Robert Jacques Turgot, who strongly influenced his economic, anti-mercantilist views. For example, just before Smith arrived in France, Quesnay's Tableau économique was published, arguing that national wealth is based on the value of land produce, most of which came from agriculture. Importantly, Smith's work as a tutor for the young Duke not only provided him with a generous annual salary, but also secured him a lifetime pension, allowing him to devote significant time and energy to his major work. It is likely that Smith had been formulating ideas about what would become The Wealth of Nations as early as his days lecturing in Edinburgh. The earliest probable mention of the actual composition of the work, however, appears in a letter Smith wrote to David Hume from Toulouse on the 5th of July in 1764, 12 years before he published the first edition of The Wealth of Nations. After the publication of The Wealth of Nations, Smith moved to London, where he engaged with intellectual circles and continued to discuss his economic theories. In 1778, he was appointed Commissioner of Customs for Scotland and returned to Edinburgh. In his later years, Smith worked on revising his works and maintained active correspondence with other scholars. He died on the 17th of June in 1790 in Edinburgh at the age of 67. Adam Smith lived during the Enlightenment, an era of intellectual upheaval in the 18th century marked by significant advances in science, philosophy, politics, and economics. In Scotland, particularly in Edinburgh, a vibrant intellectual community emerged, heavily influenced by Enlightenment ideas. This Scottish Enlightenment fostered a culture of rationality, scientific progress, and economic theory. Smith's ideas were strongly influenced by this Scottish Enlightenment, which emphasized the importance of human reason, the scientific method, and social progress. The Scottish Enlightenment also promoted the idea that economic progress and moral development were interconnected, reflecting Smith's dual focus on economics and moral philosophy. Intellectuals like David Hume and Francis Hutcheson, with whom Smith was closely associated, influenced his thinking and contributed to the intellectual atmosphere in which Smith wrote his work. Smith and Hume shared a lifelong friendship and a broad intellectual foundation, being strongly influenced by Montesquieu and a political economic thinking in broad historical trends. During the writing of his major work, Smith maintained an active correspondence with Hume. For instance, on the 7th of June in 1767, he wrote to Hume, "My business here is study in which I have been very deeply engaged for about a month past. My amusements are long, solitary walks by the seaside. You may judge how I spend my time. I feel myself, however, extremely happy, comfortable, and contented. I never was, perhaps, more so in all my life." Before the publication of his major work, mercantilism was the prevailing economic theory. Mercantilism emphasized the importance of state control over the economy, particularly through trade restrictions, tariffs, and the promotion of exports over imports. The goal was to accumulate as much gold and silver as possible, as it was believed that a nation's wealth depended on these precious metals. In practice, mercantilism led to protectionist measures, colonial policies, and trade wars, neglecting the internal economic mechanisms that contribute to wealth creation. Smith, on the other hand, argued for the benefits of free trade and market mechanisms. The social and political circumstances of Smith's time were also changing. In Britain, significant changes in social structure and political power distribution were taking place. The rising bourgeoisie gained influence and demanded more economic freedoms and political participation. These developments provided the backdrop for Smith's calls for economic freedom and less government intervention. The experiences and observations Smith made during his time directly influenced his work. The increasing importance of international trade, the development of new production techniques, and social changes formed the background for his theories on division of labor, the free market, and the role of the state in the economy. Smith's analytical approach and his ability to clearly and comprehensively present complex economic relationships significantly contributed to the importance and influence of his work. But now let's turn to the core of the video, his famous main work. The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, is divided into 5 books, which we will now summarize and analyze chronologically. In the first book, titled Of the Causes of the Wealth of Nations, Smith lays the foundation of his economic theory by emphasizing the importance of the division of labor. He explains how the division of labor leads to increased productivity by enhancing efficiency and specializing workers' skills. A well-known example is the pen factory, where dividing production steps significantly increases production. He describes, "One man draws out the wire, another straights it, a third cuts it, a fourth points it, a fifth grinds it at the top for receiving the head. To make the head requires 2 or 3 distinct operations. To put it on is a peculiar business. To whiten the pens is another. It is even a trade by itself to put them into the paper. And the important business of making a pen is, in this manner, divided into about 18 distinct operations, which in some manufactories are all performed by distinct hands, though in others the same man will sometimes perform 2 or 3 of them. By dividing work into specialized tasks, production efficiency is significantly increased. Smith estimates that such a division of labor allows a group of 10 workers to produce tens of thousands of pens daily, whereas a single worker without division of labor could hardly produce 20 pens a day. Another central concept in Book 1, besides the value of division of labor, is the invisible hand. Smith argues that individuals pursuing their own economic interests unintentionally contribute to the overall welfare. He writes, by pursuing his own interest, he frequently promotes that of the society more effectually than when he really intends to promote it. This invisible hand of the market ensures that resources are efficiently allocated, and general prosperity is promoted by individuals following their personal interests. In the second book, titled Of the Nature and Use of Capital, Smith examines the nature of capital and its role in the economy. He first divides capital into two main categories: fixed capital and circulating capital. Fixed capital includes durable means of production such as buildings, machines, and tools, which are repeatedly used to produce goods and services. Circulating capital, however, includes assets held in the form of money, raw materials, and unfinished goods that enter the production process to create finished products. He explains that money itself is not productive, but merely a medium to facilitate the exchange of goods and services. It enables specialization and division of labor by acting as a general medium of exchange. Instead, money should circulate within an economy to facilitate production and trade. Thus, he emphasizes the importance of a functioning monetary system for economic stability and growth. Smith also distinguishes between productive and unproductive capital, explaining how investments in productive capital lead to wealth accumulation, whereas unproductive expenditures diminish wealth. Productive capital is used to produce goods and services, contributing to the creation of more capital. Unproductive capital refers to expenditures that generate no further economic benefit. In this context, he also highlights the importance of capital accumulation as a prerequisite for economic growth, which can be further enhanced by a stable and trustworthy banking system that increases the efficiency of capital use. Saving income is only sensible if it is subsequently converted into productive capital, as only productively used capital forms the basis for future prosperity. This approach fundamentally differs from the mercantilists, who primarily sought to increase the amount of precious metals through a positive trade balance. In the third book, Smith analyzes historical developments and economic progress in different nations. He discusses the causes of varying growth and the development of economic systems in Europe. Smith argues that the natural order of economic progress in a society moves from agriculture to manufacturing and then to trade. This implicitly relativizes the French physiocrat's approach, which centered on the wealth derived from agriculture. He explains that agriculture is merely the first stage of economic development as it meets people's basic needs. Once these needs are met, society can begin to specialize in manufacturing and trade. In the third book, Smith analyzes as well how the feudal system in Europe hindered the natural development of wealth. He explains that the feudal system, where landowners had great power and control over land workers, restricted productivity and trade. He writes, under the feudal system, the greater part of the lands were engrossed by a few great lords, who, being generally engaged in perpetual wars, regarded their estates rather as means of power than as sources of revenue, and were often not at all anxious to cultivate or improve them. He then explains how the rise of trade and urban life gradually undermined the power of the feudal lords. The development of towns and trading posts allowed farmers to sell their products in markets, increasing their economic independence. Smith analyzes the interdependencies between urban and rural areas. He explains that cities and the countryside depend on each other and support each other economically. Cities provide markets for agricultural products, while the countryside supplies food and raw materials for the urban population. Smith's analysis of the feudal system fundamentally shows how institutional frameworks and power structures influence economic development, forming the basis of modern economic and development theory. The fourth book, titled Of Systems of Political Economy, Smith explicitly addresses mercantilism and physiocracy, and advocates for free trade and economic liberalism. The great object of the mercantile system is to increase the quantity of gold and silver in any country by increasing that of its exports and diminishing that of its imports, he writes, criticizing this view as it neglects the real sources of wealth, productivity, and trade in favor of accumulating precious metals. Smith also argues that trade restrictions such as tariffs and import bans hinder free trade and lead to inefficient resource allocations. He advocates for free trade, allowing nations to specialize in the production of goods in which they have comparative advantages. He is also critical of subsidies and monopolies granted by governments to promote certain industries. He argues that such interventions cause distortions and inefficiencies by restricting competition and artificially raising market prices. In this regard, Smith examines the economic relationships between European powers and their colonies. He criticizes the colonial trade system, which aims to use colonies as markets for the mother countries and sources of raw materials. For him, this system restricts free trade and leads to the exploitation of the colonies. Furthermore, in Book 4, Smith assigns the state three main duties. First, the duty of protecting the society from the violence and invasion of other independent societies. Secondly, the duty of protecting, as far as possible, every member of the society from the injustice or oppression of every other member of it. Thirdly, the duty of erecting and maintaining certain public works and certain public institutions, which it can never be for the interest of any individual or small number of individuals to erect and maintain. In the fifth book, Smith addresses public finances and the role of the state in the economy. He discusses the different types of taxes and their effects on the economy. Smith first examines the various sources of government revenue, particularly taxes. He outlines four main principles of taxation, known today as Smith's canons of taxation, which are equity, certainty, convenience, and economy. By equity, he means that taxes should be levied according to the ability of citizens to pay, thus proportionally to their income. He writes, "The subjects of every state ought to contribute towards the support of the government, as nearly as possible, in proportion to their respective abilities, that is, in proportion to the revenue which they respectively enjoy under the protection of the state." He then discusses the impact of public debt and warns of the dangers of excessive government debt. He argues that long-term debt jeopardizes the financial stability of the state and can lead to higher taxes and economic uncertainty. However, he emphasizes the importance of government investments in education and infrastructure as essential prerequisites for economic growth and the general welfare of a nation. Overall, Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, as its dense content suggests, had a profound impact on economic theory and economic policy practice of his time. His arguments for free trade, division of labor, and the role of the market laid the foundation for modern economics. In the economic liberalism of the 19th century, Smith became the recognized originator of laissez-faire economics, although the French coined the term that Smith never used. On the other hand, he included passages in The Wealth of Nations that inspired Karl Marx, especially in Book 5, Chapter 1, when he writes, "In the progress of the division of labor, the employment of the far greater part of those who live by labor, that is, of the great body of the people, comes to be confined to a few very simple operations, frequently to one or two. The man whose whole life is spent in performing a few simple operations, of which the effects too are, perhaps, always the same, or very nearly the same, has no occasion to exert his understanding, or to exercise his invention, in finding out expedients for removing difficulties which never occur. He naturally loses, therefore, the habit of such exertion, and generally becomes as stupid and ignorant as it is possible for a human creature to become." Even today, Adam Smith's work remains highly relevant. His ideas continue to influence economic debates and political decisions worldwide. The principles of free markets and division of labor are central elements of the modern economy and form the basis for many economic policy approaches. Smith's vision of a prosperous and efficient economy, driven by individual freedom and market dynamics, remains a guiding principle for economists and policymakers alike. However, like any work, there are aspects of The Wealth of Nations that are debatable or contentious. For example, in Chapter 2 of Book 4, Smith writes, "Every individual necessarily labors to render the annual revenue of the society as great as he can. He generally, indeed, neither intends to promote the public interest, nor knows how much he is promoting it. He intends only his own gain. And he is in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention." This quote shows that Smith assumes individuals make the best decisions for themselves. This assumption implies that they have the necessary or at least the best available information to do so. In reality, market participants often have incomplete, asymmetric, or incorrect information, leading to inefficient market outcomes. In the same chapter, he writes, "By pursuing his own interest, he frequently promotes that of the society more effectually than when he really intends to promote it." Here, Smith assumes that the pursuit of self-interest automatically leads to positive societal outcomes, ignoring the existence of negative externalities. Externalities, such as environmental pollution, can incur significant costs not reflected in the market price. Smith's concept of the invisible hand is also based on the assumption that individuals act rationally and always maximize their own interests. Modern behavioral economics, however, shows that people often act irrationally and that their decisions are influenced by cognitive biases and emotions. Smith's theory also focuses on labor as the primary factor in determining value and neglects the role of other factors such as supply and demand. Smith's labor theory of value does not account for the role of capital and technological innovations, which, to be fair, probably no one could have imagined during his lifetime. In modern production processes, machines, technologies, and capital investments are crucial for efficiency and productivity. These factors influence production costs and therefore the value of a good. Karl Marx built on Smith's labor theory of value and developed it further. Marx argued that the value of a good is determined by the socially necessary labor time required for its production. The neoclassical economics of the late 19th century largely replaced Smith's labor theory with the marginal utility theory. This theory explains the value of a good based on the utility it provides to consumers and how much they are willing to pay for it, based on their preferences and budget constraints. So despite some minor limitations, we can conclude that The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith remains a remarkably insightful book for its time and a worthwhile read for anyone interested in economic theory and history. If you enjoyed watching this video, please subscribe and leave a thumbs up to support our new channel. Thanks a lot.